The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The hangar smelled of engine wash and ozone. Anakin Skywalker ran anyway. His boots struck the durasteel in hard, uneven rhythm, not the controlled sprint of a soldier, but the desperate lurch of a man outrunning his own hesitation. The hangar bay of the Jedi Temple stretched wide around him, a cathedral of cold blue light, and somewhere at its far end, Mace Windu was already walking toward a ship. The window was closing. Anakin didn't slow. He cut between two grounded lot gunships, the downdraft from an ascending transport flattening his robes against his body, and fixed his eyes on the broad back of the Council's most formidable master. Master Windu. Mace kept walking. One of the temple guards flanking him turned a masked face in Anakin's direction. Master Windu. Louder now. The words scraped raw in his throat. Mace stopped. He turned slowly, with the particular economy of motion that characterized everything he did. No wasted movement, no theatrical pause. Just the complete, unhurried pivot of a man who had learned centuries ago that urgency was almost always someone else's problem. His eyes found Anakin, and stayed there. Skywalker, the voice was flat, measured. This isn't the time. It's the only time. Anakin crossed the last 20 meters at a walk. His heart was still hammering. He could feel it in his temples, in the flesh of his mechanical hand where the fingers had locked into a fist. I need you to hear me. Right now. Before you leave. Something shifted in Mace's expression, not softening, exactly, more like attention. The specific quality of attention a man gives when the Force has already told him that whatever's coming next will matter. He raised a hand. The honor guard stepped back. Then, speak. Anakin opened his mouth, closed it. The words he'd rehearsed on the run across the temple, the careful, sequenced argument, the evidence first and the conclusion second, dissolved. What came out instead was the truth, bare and blunt and fully unmanaged. It's Palpatine. He's the Sith Lord. Darth Sidious. I know it. I can prove it. The hangar did not react. Transports kept ascending. A maintenance droid rolled past on some indifferent errand. The galaxy continued. Oblivious. Mace Windu was very still. It lasted only a moment, that stillness, but Anakin had spent enough years around Jedi Masters to recognize what it was. Not disbelief. Not the tactical pause of a man deciding whether to draw his weapon. Something quieter than either of those. A kind of internal calibration. A sense being consulted that operated somewhere below language. Shatterpoint. He'd heard the word once, years ago, from a senior Padawan who spoke of Windu's ability the way soldiers spoke of terrain they'd never personally crossed. The capacity to perceive the fracture lines in a given moment, to see where force, applied precisely, would either shatter or preserve. Whatever Mace was reading now, Anakin couldn't see it. He could only stand in it. Then Mace's expression did something Anakin had never seen it do before. The combat-ready set of his jaw eased. Fractionally, the calculation in his eyes gave way to something that occupied the same space as grief. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Anakin talked for 11 minutes. He knew the count because the hangar's chronometer was visible over Mace's shoulder, and he watched it move while the words came, needing something external to anchor against. He told him about the appointment, Palpatine's request that Anakin sit on the council as his personal representative, the thing that had felt like an honor and now felt like a leash being attached. He told him about the opera, the legend of Darth Plagueis, the words spoken in that low, confiding voice. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. He told him about the private meetings, the architecture of dependence constructed so gradually he hadn't recognized it until he was already inside it. He told him about Padam. Not all of it. Enough of it. And then he told him what Palpatine had said 3 hours ago. I am the Senate. The words landed in the space between them. Mace didn't move. He didn't deny it, Anakin said. He told me. He wanted me to know. He's been using me for years, shaping me, and he wanted me to see the shape of it now that he thought I was close enough to the edge to fall. The mechanical fingers opened, flexed. He miscalculated. Silence. A real one. This time. Then Mace said, "You came here instead. I came here instead." Another beat. Mace looked at him, through him almost, with an expression Anakin had no useful name for. Not suspicion. Not the familiar, carefully managed wariness the Council had aimed at him for years like a low-grade current. Something older than suspicion. Something that had survived long enough to know the difference. "You have done the hardest thing a Jedi can do, Anakin." Mace's voice was low, and even, and entirely without performance. "You looked at the man who has power over you, and you told the truth anyway." A pause. "We believe you. You are coming with us." The pressure in Anakin's chest, the weight that had lived there so long he'd stopped registering it the way a man stops registering the cold of a room he's always lived in, moved, not disappeared. Moved, like a stone shifted off a nerve that had gone numb beneath it. He nearly said something. He didn't know what. It didn't matter. Because Mace was already turning toward the comms officer standing 20 meters back, already in motion, and the motion itself was the point, not sympathy extended and then withdrawn, but deployment, and Anakin understood without being told that this was what being believed looked like. Not a conversation. An action. He followed. The hologram of Yoda flickered into presence above the comms table, small and green and impossibly ancient, the background behind him a cascade of Kashyyyik's forest canopy lit by distant cannon fire. He listened without interrupting. At the edge of the projection, a battle was being won. When Mace finished, Yoda was quiet for 3 seconds. "Sense this coming, I did not," he said at last. The ancient voice carried no shame in the admission, only the weight of someone taking accurate inventory. "Trust the boy, I do." The hologram of Obi-Wan arrived a moment later from Utapau, half his face shadowed, the other half reading Anakin with an intensity that looked like concern assembling itself in real time. "Anakin. A. Beat. Are you certain?" Anakin met his former master's eyes across 100 light-years of carrier signal. He felt, in his chest, the ghost of every moment he'd almost said something and chosen silence instead. The years of it. The accumulated weight. "I've never been more certain of anything." Obi-Wan held his gaze. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite sorrow. The specific expression of a man realizing that the thing he'd feared for years had arrived, and that its arrival was, improbably, also the resolution of it. He gave a single nod. "Then tell me what you need." The plan built itself in pieces across the next 20 minutes, quick and operational, voices moving between Coruscant and Kashyyyk and Utapau, with the practiced efficiency of a command structure that had spent 3 years learning to think across distances. Jocasta knew. The relay hub. Rex and the inhibitor chips. The strike team. The office. The approach. Anakin sat at the edge of the table and listened. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, his mind was quiet. Palpatine's voice had lived there for years. He hadn't named it until now. The low, patient whisper of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly which frequencies of fear cut deepest. The loss of Padme. The failure of his power. The fundamental wrongness of Anakin Skywalker that the Council had always been too careful to say aloud, but had never been careful enough to hide. The voice was gone. Not healed. Not resolved. Gone the way a signal goes when the transmitter is cut, not because the air changed, but because the source lost its power. He looked up. Mace was watching him from across the table, one hand resting flat on its surface, a man taking measure not of an asset or a liability but of another person. Anakin held the look, didn't flinch from it. Mace turned back to the hologram. "Then we do this the Jedi way." His voice carried through the chamber without effort, the particular register of a man accustomed to rooms going still when he chose to fill them. Together, a pause, final and deliberate, as a door closing. No one acts alone. The chronometer above the hangar entrance read 3 hours to sunset. They had work to do. The 501st Barracks smelled like clone troopers always smelled. Sweat and weapon oil and the particular metallic undertone of armor stored too long in recycled air. Anakin had spent 3 years finding that smell grounding. Tonight it made his stomach turn. Rex was already awake. He stood at the far end of the bunk row with a datapad in one hand and the expression of a man who had learned, through long experience, to be suspicious of generals who arrived unannounced after dark. The blue of the barracks standby lighting caught the scar at his jawline, the paint worn thin on his pauldron. He looked at Anakin's face and put the datapad down. "Sir, walk with me." They found a maintenance corridor 2 levels below the barracks floor, a narrow concrete throat of pipes and conduit that smelled of coolant and disuse. Anakin didn't pace. He stood with his back against the wall and chose his words with the care of a man diffusing something. "Rex, I need you to trust me on something that's going to sound insane." Rex crossed his arms. "With respect, General, most things you ask me to do sound insane before they don't." Anakin almost smiled, didn't quite get there. "This is different." He laid it out in pieces, deliberately small ones, not because Rex couldn't handle it, but because the truth had a specific shape and shape mattered. He started with the chip. Not Palpatine. Not Sidious. Not the conspiracy that stretched back decades across both sides of a manufactured war. Just the chip. A device, he told Rex, embedded in the neural tissue of every clone soldier. A device with a specific function. A device no one had asked their consent about. Rex didn't move while he listened. His eyes stayed on Anakin with the fixed, evaluative calm of a soldier triangulating a position. "You're saying someone built an off switch into my men," he said, when Anakin finished. "Yes, into me. Yes." The corridor hummed with the indifferent machinery of the building. Rex looked at the wall for a moment, jaw tight, something working behind his eyes that Anakin didn't interrupt. "Who do we talk to?" Rex said finally. "Kicks. Off. The books. Neural tissue scan. Full workup. I need confirmation before we take this any further." Rex was already moving toward the door. Kicks worked without questions, which Anakin appreciated more than he could say. The 501st's medic had the hands of someone who'd done field surgery in the back of a gunship, with explosions 6 meters overhead, steady and economical, no wasted motion. He positioned Rex in the portable scanner's cradle and ran the beam slowly from crown to base of skull, eyes on the readout with the focused neutrality of a man reading a language he was fluent in. He stopped. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Long enough to be a verdict. "There's something here," Kix said. He didn't look up from the readout. Posterior hypothalamic region. Small. Very clean. Doesn't match any standard implant in the Republic Medical Registry. A pause. "It's got receiver architecture." Rex stood up from the scanner cradle before Kix finished the sentence. He crossed to the readout screen and looked at his own brain chemistry with an expression Anakin had no language for, a kind of stillness that lived just on the wrong side of fury. The look of a man who had built his entire identity on loyalty, discovering that the loyalty had been manufactured into him like a component. "Every man," Rex said. Not a question. "Every man," Anakin confirmed. Rex turned away from the screen. His hands were at his sides, precisely still, in the way that hands got when a person was working very hard at something. He stood like that for a moment that stretched. Then, "What do you need from us?" 40 minutes later and 6 levels up, Jocasta Nu did not look up from her terminal when Anakin entered the archive's annex. "Close the door," she said. He did. She was already pulling schematics, not the temple's schematics, but the Republic's communications infrastructure. A layered web of relay towers and transceiver hubs mapped across Coruscant's upper cityscape, like a circulatory system. She'd been working before he arrived. He wondered if she'd slept at all. "The Chancellor's priority broadcast channel," she said, tracing a line on the display with one finger, "doesn't route through Senate communications like most people assume." She tapped a node near the map's western edge. "It routes through here. Sub-level relay station. Verity District. Built during the Ruzan Reformation to ensure executive authority could reach clone command channels, even during a comms blackout." She looked at him over the edge of her glasses. The Reformation's architects believed centralization was strength. They built a single authentication node. The encryption key that validates any executive order to clone command frequencies lives here, and only here. Every relay in the network receives the signal. Without this node's authentication handshake, not one of them resolves the directive. A pause, precise and unhurried. Centralization. The single greatest vulnerability of any system that believes itself invulnerable. Who knows about this? Me, now, 3 Republic comms engineers who have long since retired. And whoever built it. She closed the schematic. The shadows are already briefed. They leave in 40 minutes. The Verity District Relay Station occupied the basement of a building that officially housed a mid-level Republic Agricultural Subsidy Office. The building was dark at this hour. The street above it was not. Coruscant's undercity traffic moved in its perpetual amber current, indifferent to everything beneath it. The 3 shadows moved through a maintenance access tunnel that smelled of decades-old rust and standing water. Their names were Corvin, Sereth, and a woman who went by Trace who had the specific economy of motion that came from years of operating in places where motion could get you killed. Corvin took point. He was lean and careful. The kind of careful that had survived a dozen operations in Separatist territory by treating silence as a resource to be spent wisely and only when necessary. They reached the tunnel junction and stopped. Voices, 2 of them, above. The grated ceiling of the tunnel showed slivers of light. A Coruscant Guard patrol, from the boot cadence, running a sweep of the building's lower perimeter. Trace put a hand flat in the air. Everyone froze. The patrol moved in short grid patterns, the way guard units did when they were covering assigned territory rather than tracking a specific threat. 2 minutes, maybe 3. The voices were close enough to distinguish individual words, something about a rotation schedule, something about a card game ode. Corvin breathed once, slowly, through his nose. The force pressed flat around the 3 of them like water around stones. The patrol passed. The voices diminished. The light strips above the grating went dark again as the guards moved into the next corridor. Sereth exhaled without sound. They kept moving. The relay hub was a room the size of a large closet. Floor-to-ceiling server racks in dull gray casing that blinked with the mindless industry of machines doing exactly one thing, and doing it continuously. The air was cold and smelled of heat exchangers working against themselves. It hummed at a frequency that lived in the back teeth. Trace worked the panel without tools. Not because she was showing off. Because the access architecture of a Reformation-era relay station had never been updated past its original design, which made it simultaneously less sophisticated than anything built in the last 50 years, and more familiar to someone who'd trained specifically on pre-war infrastructure. She found the broadcast routing core behind the 3rd rack. She placed the override, a device roughly the size of a credit chip, matte black, completely unremarkable, against the authentication housing. It adhered with a sound barely louder than a breath. A single indicator light on its face blinked once, twice, then settled into a slow, patient green pulse. She looked at Corvin. He was already on the secure comlink. Back in the temple's situation room, Mace stood with his arms folded and his eyes on the comlink relay with the expression of a man who had learned not to anticipate outcomes too specifically, because the galaxy had a way of penalizing specificity. The signal came through clean. Corvin's voice, flat and professional, "It's done." Anakin was standing 2 meters to Mace's left. He watched the master's shoulders drop by a degree no one else in the room probably caught. Mace looked at him. "When the moment comes," he said, "he'll scream into an empty room." Anakin nodded. The mechanics of it settled in his mind with a cold clarity. Palpatine at whatever hour he chose to reach for his emergency channel, pressing the transmitter and hearing nothing. No authentication handshake completed. No signal resolved. No clone army triggered. Decades of engineering, of patience, of manufactured catastrophe, routed into silence by a device no larger than a coin, placed by a woman who knew how Reformation-era relay stations were wired. The chip in Rex's skull would never fire. Not tonight. Not ever. Anakin looked at the chronometer. 2 hours to sunrise. Outside, Coruscant kept moving in its billions, unaware that the shape of the next 30 years had just quietly changed in a basement closet in the Verity district. He thought of Padme's sleep at 500 Republica. He let himself think it without flinching. The door to Padme's apartment opened before Anakin knocked. She'd been awake. He could tell from the way she stood in the threshold, not startled, not sleep-soft, but fully present, fully dressed, with the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting, without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. Her eyes moved across his face the way they always did when she was reading him, quick and precise. The same way she read a legislative brief or a diplomatic communique. Looking for the thing beneath the stated thing. She found it. "Come in," she said, and stepped back, and the door closed behind him. The apartment was quiet at this hour. The city beyond the windows was not. Coruscant never was. But the light that filtered through the transparistile was the distant, diffuse amber of 10,000 inhabited levels stacked below them, softened to something almost peaceful by the height. Anakin stood in it for a moment without speaking. He was aware, in a way he hadn't been in the hangar or the barracks or the archives, of how his own body felt. The tension he'd carried across the last 6 hours had not resolved. It had reorganized. Less like a fist, and more like a foundation, something to stand on rather than something pushing him off balance. Padme was watching him from across the room. "You're different," she said. Not a question, a notation. "I told Mace Windu," Anakin said, "about Palpatine." "Everything." She went very still. "He believed me." Anakin continued. "The council is moving. There's an operation already, 2 tracks running simultaneously. I can explain the details, but that's not why I'm here." He crossed the room and sat, not because he was tired, but because the conversation needed that. Needed the physical grammar of 2 people choosing to be in the same space, rather than talking across it. "I'm here because what Mace and the Jedi can do in that office, that can neutralize him. What it can't do is hold afterward. Not without the Senate. Not without law." Padme sat across from him. Her hands rested on her knees, still, and she looked at him with the expression she reserved for problems that had just become real. Not abstract concerns or political hypotheticals, but actual machinery that needed to be operated correctly, or it would fail. "Tell me everything," she said. In sequence. He did. She didn't interrupt. That was one of the things about Padme that Anakin had understood early and never stopped being grateful for. She listened the way she spoke, with full attention, storing what she heard rather than running ahead of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she rose and crossed to the comm panel on the far wall. "I'm calling Bail," she said. "Now? Right now." She was already pressing the connect sequence. "If you're telling me what I think you're telling me, we have hours, not days. And Bail needs lead time." She glanced back at him. He's awake. He's always awake when something is happening. I don't know how he knows, he just does. The comlink chimed twice. Then Bail Organa's voice came through, clear and unhurried, with only the faintest trace of interrupted sleep underneath it. "Padme, it's late. It's early," she said. "And I need you here, in person, not on comms. How quickly can you come?" A pause. Shorter than it should have been. 20 minutes. He arrived in 18. Bail Organa moved through the world with the manner of a man who had long ago accepted that his responsibilities were larger than his comfort, and had made his peace with it. He wore a dark civilian coat over his Senate formal wear, which meant he'd been up, or nearly so, and had dressed rather than come in nightclothes on general principle, because Bail Organa was constitutionally incapable of appearing before a colleague unprepared. He took the chair beside the low table, looked between Padme and Anakin once, read something in the geometry of the room, and said, "How bad?" "Worse than bad," Padme said, "but possibly manageable." She sat forward. "Palpatine is Darth Sidious. Anakin has confirmed it, the Jedi Council has confirmed it, and a strike team is preparing to move on his office within the next 12 hours. The question that she indicated herself and Bail with a short gesture, need to answer, right now tonight, is what happens after." Bail looked at Anakin. Anakin met his eyes and didn't elaborate. The story had been told. The evidence was the evidence. Bail looked at the table for 4 seconds. Then he looked back at Padme. The petition. The petition, she agreed. We have 2,000 signatures. Padme. Senators who agreed that Palpatine should relinquish his emergency powers after the war. Not that he's a Sith Lord who manufactured the war in the first place. That's a different document. It's the same legal mechanism. She was precise about it, unhurried, the way she got when she was moving through an argument she'd already run to its conclusion. Emergency session. Full Senate convened on grounds of constitutional crisis. We present Jedi testimony, Master Windu's account, Anakin's sworn statement, and we present the chip evidence. She looked at Anakin. Kix will document everything? Chain of custody? Medical certification? Rex is handling it, Anakin said. By morning there will be a full medical report, certified by a Republic combat medic, documenting the device in Rex's own neural tissue. He's pulling 3 additional troopers for corroborating scans. Bail absorbed this slowly. A Jedi's word against a sitting chancellor, he said, thinking aloud rather than arguing, is a scandal. The Senate can survive a scandal. It will want to. He paused. But a Jedi's word plus a bioweapon in half the clone army is a coup discovered, Padme said. That's not politics anymore, Bail, that's a trial. The room held the weight of that for a moment. Outside, the city moved in its ceaseless amber tide, indifferent. Bail exhaled slowly. Set his hands flat on his knees, the gesture of a man who had made a decision and was now cataloging its operational requirements. Mon Mothma, he said. We need her from the start, not as a co-signer after the fact. She carries the outer rim moderates and half the mid-rim reform bloc if she's standing beside us when we introduce the motion. The holdouts lose their primary political cover. He looked at Padme. Can you reach her tonight? I can reach her right now. Then do it. He rose, pulling a small datapad from his coat pocket. I'll start drafting the emergency motion language. Invoking Section 47 of the Constitution, Executive Emergency Powers Review triggered by material evidence of criminal conspiracy. It's never been used. It was written for exactly this. He paused at the table's edge. We'll need the arrest to have happened before we convene. The moment he's in Jedi custody, his executive authority lapses pending formal review. That's our window. Mace knows. Anakin said. They're not moving until they're certain the operation is clean. Bail nodded once, the nod of a man filing a confirmed variable. Then he sat back down and opened the datapad and began to write, and the apartment became something it hadn't been 60 seconds earlier. A working room. A place where the machinery of resistance was assembling itself in real time from the parts that had always been there, waiting for someone to name what they were for. An hour later, Bail was still writing. Mon Mothma had been reached, briefed in careful language over a secured channel, and had said 3 words, I'll be there, before the comlink closed. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Padme walked Anakin to the door. They stood in the threshold for a moment, the corridor behind him dim and empty. The apartment behind her full of the soft industry of Bail's stylus against a datapad. She looked at him. He looked at her. You're not afraid, she said. Again, a notation, not a question. I'm terrified, he said, but it's the right kind. She considered that. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, softer than a smile, and more specific. She reached out and touched his hand. Just that. Her fingers over his for a moment, brief and deliberate. Go, she said. We have work to do. He went. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, final sound, and he walked back into the dark corridor with the particular lightness of a man who has stopped carrying a secret that was never his to carry alone. The chronometer at the corridor's end read 1 hour to dawn. In the apartment behind him, Bail Organa was building the legal architecture that would hold the galaxy's future in place. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The temple armory at dawn smelled of ozone and old leather, and the particular mineral sharpness of freshly charged power cells. It was a functional room, not a ceremonial one. Bare durasteel shelving, utilitarian lighting. The quiet industry of preparation without performance. Anakin checked the charge on his lightsaber for the third time and put it away. Across the room, Kit Fisto was wrapping his hands with thin cortosis weave strips, a personal habit from a decade of close-quarters combat, his head-tails moving with a loose, easy rhythm that didn't match the occasion. He caught Anakin watching and gave a small, unhurried nod. The kind that meant, "I've done this before. You'll do it too." Aegon Kolar stood at the room's center with his eyes closed. He wasn't meditating. His breathing was too shallow for meditation, too aware. He was listening. Taking inventory of the building's acoustics, the weight of the force in the space. Running his own private threat assessment through sensory channels most people didn't know to use. Sissy Tian arrived last, said nothing, and began his pre-mission checks with the meticulous focus of a pilot running pre-flight. Systematic, unhurried, every clasp tested twice. 5 temple guards stood at the armory's far wall, masked double-bladed sabers at their backs. Anonymous in their ceremonial armor in a way that had always struck Anakin as quietly unnerving, and now struck him as appropriate. This was exactly the kind of operation their existence had always been preparing for. Mace Windu stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, check your comms. We're on temple encrypted channels only. Nothing through Republic relays. Everyone checked. The acknowledgements came back in sequence, economical and flat. Mace looked at Anakin last. Anakin met his eyes and nodded. They walked out into the morning. Coruscant at dawn was a study in contrast, the upper levels catching the first thin light of the star in pale gold, while the city's infinite lower depths remained locked in their permanent artificial night. The air at temple level carried a trace of wind from the upper atmosphere, the kind of cold that sharpened things rather than numbing them. The 6 of them walked in a formation that wasn't quite a formation, not a military column, not a ceremonial procession, but the natural geometry of people moving with shared purpose. The temple guards flanking and slightly back. The 4 masters and Anakin at the front. They moved at a deliberate pace. Not slow, not fast. The pace of people who had already decided what they were doing and required no additional commitment of speed to confirm it. The Republic Executive Building was 40 minutes on foot from the temple's main approach, routed through the ambassadorial district and along the upper promenade of the Senate Quarter. Mace had chosen the route specifically. Not the fastest, not the most concealed, the most visible. The HoloNet news drones found them at the 12-minute mark. Anakin heard the soft whir of repulsor lifts before he saw the first one, a small, disc-shaped unit, hovering at an intersection 40 meters ahead, its lens rotating to track their approach. Within 90 seconds there were 4 more, hovering at respectful distances like cautious birds. Mace didn't acknowledge them. Neither did anyone else. The drones followed. At a transit hub near the Senate Quarter's outer approach, a cluster of morning commuters on an elevated walkway paused. Anakin watched it happen in stages, the first person stopping, the ripple of attention spreading outward as others noticed what had stopped him. The collective stillness of 24 people watching 6 Jedi move through the city with the quiet, absolute surety of a law of physics. One commuter, a human woman, middle-aged, a work bag over one shoulder, said something to the person beside her. Anakin was too far to hear it. The person beside her said nothing, just watched. The news drones kept pace 30 meters off their left flank. He built his power on shadows and lies. Mace's voice was conversational, addressed to no one in particular and everyone present. "We're done," meeting him in the dark. Anakin glanced sideways at him. "You knew they'd be watching. I counted on it." A beat. Palpatine has spent 20 years making the Jedi look like something apart from the Republic. Separate, unaccountable, a power that served itself before it served anything else. The promenade opened ahead of them into a wide concourse, morning light cutting across the durasteel in long pale bars. Today we walk to the building everyone can see. Through the streets everyone can see. In full view of every news drone on this district's grid. His jaw was set, but his voice stayed level. When this is over, no one will be able to say we moved in secret. No one will be able to say we staged a coup. Kit Fisto, 2 paces to Anakin's right, said, assuming it goes well. It will go well, Mace said. Not as optimism, as operational assessment. Fisto accepted this with a small tilt of his head. Somewhere in the Republic Executive Building, 40 minutes north of where they walked, Palpatine was receiving his morning briefings. Anakin didn't know this for certain. He constructed it from what he knew of the man, the immaculate precision of his daily schedule, the way he used routine as a form of control, the satisfaction he took in each morning's orchestration of appearances, the performance of normalcy. He was sitting behind that desk right now. In that chair. With that expression, the warm, grandfatherly benevolence of a man who had decided, decades ago, that the face he showed the galaxy was itself a weapon. The thought of it produced something in Anakin's chest that was not anger. Anger had a heat to it, an irrationality. This was colder. Denser, the specific sensation of clarity about something you have been confused by for a very long time. He had sat across from Palpatine's desk more times than he could number, had absorbed that voice, those careful questions, the slow architecture of concern and confidence and manufactured intimacy, had believed, at various moments, that it was the truest relationship in his life. The knowledge that it was engineering rather than affection should have felt like loss. It felt, instead, like a diagnosis, the specific relief of a wound finally named, which doesn't make it hurt less, but makes it hurt differently. He kept walking. The executive building's main promenade came into view at the 38-minute mark. 4 Republic guards flanked the primary entrance, ceremonial posts. Largely, the building's actual security nested deeper inside. They tracked the approaching group with the trained attention of men who had been taught to evaluate threats without showing that they were doing so. They saw the lightsabers, the temple guards, Mace Windu's face. One of them reached for his comlink, thought better of it, let his hand fall. The news drones were still tracking, holding their distance, their lenses fixed. Mace didn't slow. The 6 of them crossed the promenade in the morning light, the shadows long behind them, and came to the wide durasteel doors of the Republic Executive Building. The doors were closed. They were always closed. Mace stopped. The temple guards flanked left and right without being directed, positioning themselves with the unhurried competence of people who understood their function completely. Kolar settled into his stance at Mace's right shoulder, Tian to his left. Kit Fisto moved slightly forward and slightly apart. The natural spacing of a man who fought better with room and knew it. Anakin stood at Mace's left, 1 step behind. Mace raised his right hand, not toward his saber, not in a fist. Just raised, open, palm forward, as though he was placing it against a surface not yet reached. The doors opened. Some systems in the Republic Executive Building were keyed to Council-level Jedi credentials, an accommodation built into the security architecture during the early years of the Clone Wars, when rapid response access had seemed more important than whatever future scenario might make it a vulnerability. No one had updated that assessment. The doors opened and the morning light fell through them into the corridor beyond, and Mace Windu walked through without pause. And the rest of them followed, and behind them Coruscant continued in its morning industry, and on the HoloNet feeds that were already running the footage, the Chiron read, breaking, Jedi Council delegation enters Executive District. No one who watched it knew exactly what it meant yet. They would. The Chancellor's office smelled of old wood and polished stone and something beneath both of those. Something older. Chemical. The faint ozone signature of a space where the dark side had been quietly cultivated for years the way mold cultivates in walls, invisible until the structure fails. Anakin noticed it the moment the inner doors opened. He hadn't noticed it before. He'd been in this office dozens of times, hundreds. Perhaps, if he counted the brief audiences and the late-night conversations and the quiet afternoons when Palpatine had poured tea and asked careful, patient questions about Anakin's dreams. He had never noticed the smell. He noticed it now the way you notice the pitch of a sound after someone names it, suddenly unable to unhear what you couldn't previously isolate. The office was exactly as he remembered. The wide, curved desk. The sweeping, transparent steel view of Coruscant's skyline. The city's morning face caught in pale light. The Republic's flag at the room's far edge. The statuary in its alcoves. the low illumination that made the space feel intimate rather than official. Palpatine stood behind the desk. He had heard them coming, or felt them, of course he had. His expression as the doors opened was already composed, already warm, already deploying the specific configuration of concerned authority that Anakin had spent years interpreting as paternal care. "Master Windu," he said, "this is unexpected. I wasn't informed of a council visit, no." Mace said. "You weren't." The six of them spread naturally across the room's entry, not surrounding the desk, not yet, but occupying the space between Palpatine and the doors with the quiet geometry of people who had discussed exactly this. The temple guards stayed at the threshold. The four masters fanned left and right. Anakin walked straight forward and stopped 6 meters from the desk. Palpatine's eyes moved to him. Something happened in them. Something brief and deep, like a stone dropped into water, the ripple contained so quickly you might believe you hadn't seen it at all. "Anakin," he said, and the voice was warm, concerned, the voice of a man seeing someone he loves in distress. "My boy." What is the meaning of this? The words landed with their usual weight, the particular gravity of a phrase used so many times it had worn grooves in the air. Anakin felt the pull of it. Old and deep, the reflex of a decade's conditioning. The part of him that had been shaped by this voice for so long, it sometimes mistook the shaping for identity. He let the pull come. Felt it fully. Let it pass. He stepped forward. "I trusted you," he said. His voice came out level, not cold. Level, which was different. Cold was a performance. Level was a decision. "I trusted you, and you used that trust as raw material. You built your access to me out of the things I was most afraid of losing, and you maintained it by making sure I stayed afraid." Another step. The desk was 4 meters away now, the carved surface of it, the hands resting on it, with their careful stillness. "I'm done being afraid of you." He reached for his lightsaber. Not fast, deliberately, with full awareness of the gesture. "Your lies end today, Sidious." The name landed in the room like a charge detonating. For exactly 1 second, nothing moved. Then Palpatine's face changed. It was not a gradual change. It was not the slow revelation of something hidden beneath a mask. It was more fundamental than that. A structural shift, as though the architecture of the expression itself had been rebuilt from the foundation. The warmth didn't fade. It inverted. The concerned furrow of the brow resolved into something precise and cold, the eyes dropping whatever light they'd been generating and becoming. Beneath it, the thing they'd always been. His robes tore at the shoulders as he moved. The motion was not human. It was the motion of something that had worn human shape for so long that the costume fit perfectly, but had never confused the costume for the body beneath. He cleared the desk in a single, corkscrew lunge, the dark side igniting around him like a pressure drop in the Force. Every living thing in the room feeling it in the hindbrain, that ancient signal, the one that had kept organisms alive for 1 billion years, by teaching them to recognize predators. A crimson blade shrieked into existence. He drove it at Mace in the same motion. No preamble, no monologue, pure offense. The strike of a man who had decided that words no longer served any purpose. Mace's saber was already up. The blades met with a crack that Anakin felt in his back teeth, the competing energies of the Force colliding in the frequency that lightsabers made only when both combatants were genuinely trying. Not sparring. Not demonstrating. Trying, Kit Fisto and Aegon Kohler split wide in the same instant, moving to the room's flanking positions with the seamless coordination of warriors who had spent years calibrating their instincts to each other. Sissy Tian went right and back, covering the window approach. The temple guards locked the doors. Palpatine registered all of this in the first half-second. Anakin watched his eyes move. The rapid inventory of a tactician cataloging the room's geometry, assessing exits, calculating vectors. Finding them covered. Finding each one closed. The calculation took less time than a breath. His expression didn't change. He pressed harder against Mace's blade. Anakin moved to the left, keeping the desk between himself and the direct line of engagement, giving Mace room to work. He felt the dark side in the space like weather, not abstract, not metaphysical, but physical, a pressure in the air, The same pressure he had grown up sensing in certain places without knowing what it was. He knew now. He had always been attuned to it. The difference was he no longer mistook attunement for belonging. Palpatine was faster than he should have been. Faster than he appeared. Faster than the age he projected. Another layer of performance. The slightly slowed movements. The careful navigation of stairs. The minor physical deferences to dignity that had always read as the graceful accommodation of an aging man, and were, like everything else, precisely calculated theater. He wasn't old. He was ageless in the way that things preserved by wrong methods are ageless, intact but fundamentally altered, the life inside them replaced by something that mimicked it. He drove Mace back 3 steps with a chain of strikes that came high-low center, the pattern designed to force a defensive posture and hold it there. Mace absorbed the first 2 and gave ground on the third, not because he couldn't hold it, Anakin recognized, but because Vapad didn't win by standing still. It won by channeling. Then Palpatine turned his head. Just slightly. Just enough. His eyes found Anakin across the room and something moved in them, the calculation shifting, the tactician selecting a different instrument. She's going to die. Anakin, the voice was new. Not the Chancellor's voice. Not the warm counsel of a mentor, but lower, rougher, the voice of something that had stopped bothering with pleasantries. Whatever you think you've changed, whatever bargain you believe you've struck with your Jedi Masters, the vision doesn't lie. You've seen it. You know what's coming for her. And not one person in this room can stop it. Anakin felt the words go in. He'd have been lying to himself if he said he didn't. He stood in the feeling for exactly the length of time it took him to recognize it. Then he said, no, not to Palpatine. To himself. Naming the shape of the fear so it couldn't operate without his permission. He ignited his saber. The blue blade caught the morning light coming through the transparent steel and threw it back across the room in broken, moving pieces. That doesn't work anymore, he said. Palpatine looked at him for 1 full second. Read something in what he saw. The calculation behind his eyes ran very quickly to its conclusion. He turned back to Mace and pressed the attack with everything he had. The blades met again, harder this time, deeper, the sound of it filling the curved office and bouncing off the stone walls and the transparent steel and the statuary in its alcoves. The morning light kept coming through the windows, indifferent and clean. Anakin moved forward into the fight. Mace Windu fought the way a storm fought. Not with strategy exactly, but with inevitability. Vapad was not a style that reasoned. It received. Every strike Palpatine threw, every burst of dark side fury that came down the blade and through the hilt and into Mace's hands, Vapad absorbed and fed back, amplified, redirected, returned with interest. The style demanded that its practitioner walk directly into the darkest thing in the room and refuse to flinch. It demanded a specific kind of courage that had nothing to do with fearlessness and everything to do with choosing, continuously, not to become the thing you were fighting. Alone, that choice was the hardest thing a Jedi could make. Mace was not alone. Palpatine targeted him first. It was the tactically sound decision. Mace was the most dangerous combatant in the room, the one whose style matched his own darkness most directly. The one whose death would create the largest psychological fracture in the remaining fighters. Take the apex predator. Scatter the rest. He drove at Mace with a sequence that Anakin, from 6 meters back, could barely track. High strikes flowing into mid-body thrusts, flowing into sweeping cuts at knee level. The pattern designed to keep a defender moving through all 3 planes simultaneously, to overwhelm the body's capacity to prioritize. Against a single opponent it would have worked. Against most opponents it had worked. Mace moved with it rather than against it. Let the sequence carry him sideways and back, turning the retreat into repositioning. Finding his feet at the sequence's end in a stance that was lower and wider and more patient than where he'd started. His eyes were bright. That was the thing about Vapad that even other Jedi didn't fully understand. Anakin had come to realize. It didn't look like suffering. It looked, from the outside, uncomfortably close to joy. Palpatine felt the room's geometry with the dark side the way a blind man felt a familiar space with his hands. He registered Kit Fisto at the left flank, a threat, contained. Kolar and Tien at the rear and right. Contained. The temple guards at the doors, irrelevant until they weren't. The boy. He found Anakin with his peripheral awareness and sent a force shove sideways. Hard. Without interrupting his engagement with Mace. It hit a cabinet 2 meters to Anakin's left, because Anakin had already moved. Had read the intent a half-second before the action. The way he always read combat, not analytically, but physically, his body processing threat information faster than his conscious mind tracked it. He stepped into the space the shove had cleared. Palpatine noted this. Filed it. Pressed harder at Mace. "You cannot sustain this," he said to Mace, and the voice had lost all its register of humanity. It was a tool now, like the saber, deployed for specific mechanical effect. Vapad requires an anchor, Master Windu. Something to hold on to. Some reason the darkness doesn't simply take you. A strike, diagonal, caught on Mace's blade with a sound like breaking rock. "What are you holding on to?" Mace said nothing. He pushed forward instead of answering, and Palpatine gave 3 centimeters of ground, and the engagement moved toward the window. Anakin came in from the left. He didn't announce it. Didn't signal it. He simply read the shape of the duel the way he read aerial combat, as a system with internal logic, with openings that appeared and closed in rhythm, with moments where the geometry allowed a specific action and no other. He had been watching for 4 seconds. He had seen the pattern. Palpatine's offense against Mace moved in a repeating cycle, high sequence, body level redirect, recovery beat, high sequence again. The recovery beat lasted roughly a half-second. It was the only moment his right side opened. Anakin moved on the 3rd cycle. He came in fast and low, not committing to a strike, but forcing Palpatine to register a threat from his unguarded side. Palpatine rotated. He had to. The rotation was the only defense against a flank approach, and in rotating he interrupted the high sequence he'd been building toward Mace. Mace stepped forward, into the interrupted sequence. He advanced 3 full paces in the time Palpatine needed to re-establish his guard against both of them, and by the time the guard was re-established, Mace was inside the optimal range for Palpatine's chain strikes, and the whole tactical picture had been redrawn. 2 against 1. The geometry closed. Palpatine adapted. He was. Anakin had to acknowledge in some cold and clinical partition of his mind, extraordinary. The adaptation was immediate and complete. No moment of visible adjustment, no scramble. He simply began fighting a different duel, pulling his radius in, shortening his strikes, using the force offensively in the gaps where his blade couldn't reach, flinging the carved furniture, cracking a section of the curved window's frame, to send a spray of transparasteel fragments across the room's right side. Kolar took a fragment across the forearm, didn't break position. Tien ignited his second blade and moved to close the window angle, cutting off that vector. The room was getting smaller. Not physically. Physically it was the same curved office it had always been. The same sweeping view. The same statuary. But tactically it was shrinking. Each exit and each line of retreat narrowing as the 5 Jedi held their positions and declined to be moved. Palpatine had spent 20 years building a trap with the entire galaxy as its mechanism. He was standing in a smaller one now. The synergy moment arrived 8 minutes into the duel, and it arrived without warning. The way the decisive moments in any fight arrived, not announced, not telegraphed, simply there. Mace overpressed. It was Vapad's fundamental risk, the thing the style could never fully eliminate, the aggression that made it devastating, also made it directional. When Mace advanced, he advanced completely, all of his weight and energy committed to the forward motion, and in committing completely he opened his right shoulder, a gap, small, lasting perhaps 3/4 of a second. Palpatine found it. He didn't strike at Mace with it, he was more precise than that. He redirected, caught Mace's blade and rode it, using the press of his own attack to create a channel, then drove a counter-strike not at Mace's blade hand but at the space where Mace's right side would be, in the next half-second. It was the kind of strike that ended duels. Anakin's blade was already there. He hadn't planned it. There was no planning in this, no conscious decision, only the accumulated weight of 10,000 hours of combat training expressing itself as instinct. His gemso had caught it, had read the redirected energy in the same moment it was created, and placed his blade in the only geometry that made sense, and Palpatine's counterstrike ran into Anakin's guard, and stopped there. The energy of it absorbed and held. Gemso, the receiving style. It took what came and held it. Mace regained his right side, reset his guard. The gap closed. 3/4 of a second, start to finish. Palpatine pulled back from the exchange and for the first time since the duel began, stood still. Not resting. Assessing. His eyes moved between them, back and forth, with the rapid, precise movement of a calculation being run that was not reaching its expected conclusion. He was reading the synergy, understanding what he was looking at. Two styles that should have been individually exploitable, Vapad's aggression, Gemso's reactive nature, operating as a closed system. No gaps that one didn't cover for the other. No isolation possible as long as they moved in tandem. His jaw tightened. That was all. Just that, a tightening at the jaw, the only visible evidence of the recalculation happening behind his eyes. He looked rattled. Not afraid. Nothing so legible as fear. But rattled. The specific expression of a mind encountering a variable it had not modeled, had not included in any of its projections. Had not thought to account for. He had spent 20 years ensuring Anakin Skywalker would stand alone. He had never once planned for Anakin Skywalker to stand beside someone who trusted him. He moved. Not forward, back, a controlled retreat. The kind that preserved options rather than conceding them. 3 long steps toward the desk that put its carved surface between himself and the advancing line. His free hand dropped below the desk's edge. Anakin saw the hand. He knew what was behind the desk. He knew what sat in the drawer on the left side. The one built into the architecture of the desk itself rather than added afterward. A comm panel, custom installed, routed to a channel that bypassed the Senate Standard Communications Network entirely. A channel that ran to the clone army's command frequency. He looked at Mace. Mace had seen the hand too. Neither of them moved to stop it. They didn't need to. Palpatine's hand found the comm panel without looking. That was the thing about a contingency you had maintained for 20 years. The muscle memory of it became absolute. He didn't need to look. He didn't need to think. His fingers found the recessed panel beneath the desk's left edge, found the covered switch beneath the panel, found the transmit key beneath the cover. With the same unconscious precision that a man finds a light switch in a room he has lived in for decades. He pressed it. The channel opened with a soft, confident chime, the specific 2-tone acknowledgement signal of a Priority 1 executive broadcast, the sound that meant the transmission had been received by every relay node in the Republic's clone command network simultaneously. That within seconds the coded directive would be resolving itself against the authentication handshake that turned signal into order. The chime sounded. Palpatine's shoulders dropped a fraction. Not in defeat, in relief. The relief of a man who has just armed the mechanism that makes his current circumstances irrelevant. Whatever happened in this room in the next 60 seconds, the order was already static, not the static of an interrupted signal, not the burst and recover of a jammed transmission. A flat, total, immediate absence. The sound a channel makes when the authentication handshake it is reaching for does not exist anymore. When the infrastructure that validated it has been altered at a level so fundamental that the signal arrives and finds nothing to confirm it, nothing to resolve it into action, nothing on the other end capable of completing the sequence. The comm panel's indicator light, which should have been cycling through its transmission confirmation sequence, showed a single flat amber line. Dead channel. Palpatine looked at the panel. He pressed the key again. The amber line didn't change. The room was very quiet. The duel had stopped, not by agreement, not by exhaustion, but by the specific gravity of the moment. All parties in the room understanding simultaneously that something had shifted that made the immediate resumption of combat secondary to the processing of what had just happened. Mace stood 4 meters from the desk with his blade still lit, his breathing controlled, watching. Anakin stood to Mace's left and watched Palpatine's face. He had spent more hours studying that face than almost any other in his life. He knew its architecture intimately, the precise way each muscle group moved, the micro-expressions that preceded the larger ones, the tells that Palpatine himself likely didn't know he had, because he'd never had cause to consider that someone who knew him this well might one day be standing on the opposite side of a room from him. What moved across Palpatine's face now was something Anakin had never seen there before. It arrived in stages. The first was simple non-comprehension, the expression of a mind receiving data that does not fit any existing category and requiring a moment to build one. The second was verification. He pressed the key twice more, checked the indicator, checked the channel selector, pressed again. The third was understanding, and understanding was the worst of the three, because understanding meant the non-comprehension was over, and what replaced it was real. His hand came off the panel slowly. His eyes moved up from the desk. They found Mace first, then tracked to Anakin. Then, very deliberately, they moved to the single window that remained intact, the view of Coruscant's morning skyline. The city going about its business, the traffic lanes full, the Senate district visible in the middle distance. Everything outside that window continuing exactly as it had continued 5 minutes ago. That channel, he said, and his voice had lost its instrument quality. It was not being deployed now. It was simply occurring. The sound of cognition working in real time without a performance layer over it. That channel is fail-safed. It runs on independent relay infrastructure specifically so that... He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked back at the comm panel. The authentication node. It's impossible. You built an empire, Mace said, on nobody ever getting close enough to see the wiring. The voice was flat, final. The voice of a verdict being read, rather than an argument being made. We got close. Palpatine looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, deep and fast, and then gone. A galaxy away and 100 light years in every direction, nothing happened. On Kashyyyk, Yoda stood among the roots of a rosher tree with clone troopers at his flanks and felt the force settle around him like a held breath releasing. He did not know exactly what he was feeling. He knew it was the absence of something that should have arrived and hadn't. He closed his eyes for a moment. On Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi stood over the body of General Grievous and waited for something he couldn't name, some signal or shift that he had been told might come through the Force if the day went wrong. It didn't come. The clones around him milled with post-battle efficiency, and nothing changed, and after a moment he understood that nothing changing was itself the answer. On a transport in the Coruscant lower lanes, Captain Rex sat with Kix across a narrow equipment table and watched the mission chrono tick past the window Anakin had given them. The comm unit between them showed flat, clean silence, no signal, no order, no cascade of coded directives reaching for the authentication that would never come. Rex looked at Kix. Kix looked at Rex. Neither of them said anything. Rex put his helmet on the table, carefully, and looked at his hands for a moment, the gaunt-leaded fingers, the white armor, the identity built from a template and shaped, slowly, into something that was his own. He exhaled. The comm stayed silent. Back in the office, Palpatine had not moved from behind the desk. This was itself information. In every scenario Anakin had mentally rehearsed, in the hours between the hangar and this room, in the cold analytical partition of his mind that had spent years learning how Palpatine operated, retreat behind the desk had not featured in any of them. Palpatine did not retreat. He redirected. He repositioned. He turned circumstances that looked like losses into longer game advantages with a patience that made most tactical thinking look myopic. Standing still behind a desk with a dead comm panel was not a repositioning. It was what it looked like. The calculation had concluded. The result had been returned. And the result was that the specific variable Palpatine had never modeled. The one that made all other variables manageable. The one that was supposed to transform any scenario in this room from a genuine threat into a temporary inconvenience, was gone. No Order 66. No clone army turning on its Jedi commanders. No galaxy-wide execution of the one organizational structure capable of opposing him. Just a room. 6 Jedi. And a man who had spent 40 years ensuring he never had to fight without that option. He set his lightsaber on the desk. Not in surrender, in the precise controlled motion of someone removing a variable from the equation because the equation no longer supported it. His eyes moved across the room with the same rapid inventory they'd made at the duel's beginning, cataloging positions, registering the temple guards at the doors, the masters at their points, finding no exit. The motion registered in every person in the room as the thing it was, the first completely unmanaged action Sheev Palpatine had taken since Anakin Skywalker had walked into a hangar and told the truth. Then, his face did something else. The calculation ended. The inventory closed. And what was left, beneath all of it, beneath the performance and the tactics and the 20-year architecture of manufactured inevitability, was rage. Not the operationalized fury of Sith combat, not dark side energy weaponized and deployed with precision. Raw rage. The specific rage of a man who has never, not once in 40 years, encountered a wall he couldn't dismantle, who has built his entire identity on the premise that every obstacle yields to sufficient patience and sufficient intelligence and sufficient willingness to do what others won't, confronting, for the first time, a wall that was built from the one material he had never learned to work with. Trust. The anger that moved across his face was not the anger of a defeated general. It was the anger of a man realizing the defeat had been architected from something he had never once taken seriously enough to defend against. His hands, flat on the desk, pressed down until the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. He looked at Anakin. "You'll regret this," he said. Not the threat of a cornered man, the statement of a man converting loss into fuel. Already building the next version of the plan from the wreckage of this one, even now. Every one of you will regret this mercy. Mace looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. "No," he said, "we won't." The morning light came through the intact window and fell across the desk, and the dead comm panel and the lightsaber sitting on it, and outside the city kept moving. And somewhere in the Republic's clone command network, 150,000 soldiers went about their morning without knowing how close the order had come. Without knowing it had come at all, the lightning came without warning. Not because Palpatine had been concealing it, there was nothing left to conceal, no performance left to maintain. No layer of the architecture that hadn't already been stripped away in the preceding 20 minutes. It came without warning, because rage at that magnitude doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, converts itself into the nearest available weapon, and expends. The Force lightning erupted from both hands simultaneously. It hit the ceiling first, not aimed, not yet, just released. A discharge of pure dark side energy that blew the overhead illumination in a cascade of sparks and dropped the room into the gray half-light of the morning coming through the window. The statues in their alcoves cracked. A section of carved wall panel detonated outward in fragments. The temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees in 2 seconds as the dark side pulled heat from the air to feed itself. Then it found a target. The bolt came at Mace, still the primary threat, still the oldest rival, still the man whose Va pod had matched him strike for strike and given nothing back. It crossed the distance between them in a fraction of a second. Mace's blade came up. He caught it. The energy crawled across his blade in that specific, terrible way, not absorbed cleanly but contested, the lightning and the lightsaber plasma occupying the same space in a sustained argument between two kinds of power, the light burning violet at the edges where the dark side pressed against it. Mace held it, his feet planted, his guard locked, his jaw set against the pressure of it. But Palpatine had 2 hands, and the second bolt was already leaving the left. Anakin moved, not toward Palpatine, toward Mace. He stepped in front of the second bolt with his blade already in the catch position, not the same guard as Mace, not the high block, but lower and angled. The geometry that Gemso used for energy redirection rather than pure containment. The bolt hit his blade and he felt it in his arms to the shoulder, felt it in his back teeth, felt it in the prosthetic hand where the feedback was different, not painful, but present. A vibration in the metal and durasteel and synthetic nerve endings that registered the energy passing through the guard as something close to sound. He redirected. The bolt came off his blade at a 40-degree angle, diverted into the floor beside the desk, and the stone surface exploded in a burst of vaporized rock. 2 bolts caught, two masters holding their ground. Palpatine stopped. He stood with his arms extended and his chest heaving and looked at the two of them, at the blades, at the guards, at the physical reality of his most devastating offensive capability being received and held by two men working in tandem. And the rage recalibrated. He spread his hands wider and pushed more power into both channels simultaneously. The lightning intensified. This was the version that had no tactical restraint in it. Not the precision instrument of a Sith Lord controlling a Senate. Not the calculated demonstration of a mentor showing a student what power looked like. This was the reserve, the full draw, the dark side summoned from whatever depth Palpatine had been feeding for 40 years of hatred and patience and manufactured necessity. The room deteriorated around it. The second window cracked along a stress fracture and began to bow outward. The desk shifted 3 centimeters on the stone floor. The flag of the Republic in its stand near the wall caught a fragment of redirected energy and ignited, burning a clean, chemical orange before Tien's second blade cut the air and snuffed the convection feeding it. Kohler and Fisto moved inward from the flanks, not into the lightning's direct line, but tightening the perimeter, closing the angles, their lightsabers tracing defensive patterns in the air that kept the dark side energy from finding new channels into the spaces between the primary combatants. Mace advanced. 1 step. The lightning pressure was immense. Anakin could see it in the set of Mace's shoulders, in the way the blade vibrated continuously rather than in pulses. The catch not a single action, but a sustained one, a contest of will expressed as physics. And Mace was advancing into it. 1 step. Then another. Anakin matched him on the left, keeping his blade in the redirect position, the two of them moving forward through the storm together, the geometry between them constant, the gap that Palpatine might have exploited in either of them individually simply not existing because they were not individuals in this moment. They were a system, and systems don't have the gaps that people do. Palpatine pulled more power. Anakin felt the dark side spike, felt it in the Force the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm breaks, the specific sensation of something enormous drawing on a reservoir that should, by any rational accounting, be running low. It wasn't running low. That was the thing about power fed by hatred. Hatred didn't deplete. It was self-replenishing, drawing on itself, on its own depth, on the 40 years of patient fury that had kept this man moving forward through every obstacle and every setback and every moment that a lesser architecture of self would have broken under. He felt it. He walked toward it anyway. The boy who had spent a decade being ruled by fear of exactly this, of darkness, this complete, this self-sustaining, this convinced of its own inevitability, walked toward it with his blade up and his feet steady, and something in his chest that was not courage in the dramatic sense, but something quieter. Acceptance. The specific calm of a man who has looked at the worst thing and named it correctly, and found that the naming does not destroy him. Vader was never afraid of the dark, Palpatine had told him once, in that confiding voice. Vader understood it. Anakin understood it too. He had always understood it. He just wasn't going to become it. The advance covered 3 meters in what felt like a much longer time and was probably 12 seconds. At the end of those 12 seconds, Palpatine was out of room. His back found the curved wall behind the desk, not the window. Tien had that angle, but the solid stone of the office's rear curve. The wall that had no door and no exit and nothing behind it but the building's structural mass. He had nowhere to reposition to. The perimeter held. The guards held. The 5 masters and Anakin held. He kept pushing power into the lightning because stopping was not a concept available to him in this state. The dark side didn't de-escalate. It only expanded or collapsed, and collapse meant defeat, and defeat was the one thing 40 years of architecture had been specifically designed to prevent. Mace closed the last meter. His blade came forward in a precise, controlled motion, not a killing strike, not even aimed at the body. He drove it into the space between Palpatine's hands, where the lightning was generating, and the plasma field of the lightsaber intersected the Force lightning's discharge channel and disrupted it. The lightning stopped. Not gradually. Immediately, the way a sound stops when its source is removed. The silence after it was enormous. Anakin reached for his belt. The force suppression cuffs were standard Temple Guard issue. He'd taken a pair from the armory that morning without being certain he'd need them, with the operational logic of a soldier who takes every tool available when the mission parameters are unclear. His hands were steady as he crossed the last 2 meters. Palpatine looked at him. He was breathing hard. The first time in Anakin's memory that the man's physical state had been genuinely visible. The first time the body beneath the performance had shown itself as something that could be tired, could be spent, could reach the end of what it contained. His hands hung at his sides, the lightning gone, the saber still on the desk behind the tangle of combat they'd just moved through. He looked at Anakin with eyes that held, even now, the specific quality of intelligence that never stopped operating. Evaluating, looking for the angle. Anakin held his gaze and applied the cuffs. And the force went quiet around Palpatine in the way a room goes quiet when a sound you've been hearing so long you stop noticing it finally ceases. Then Palpatine's mouth moved. "You'll regret this, Mercy," he said. The voice was even, controlled, already reconstructing itself. "All of you. Every one of you will regret, no," Mace said. He was standing 2 meters back, his blade finally extinguished, his breathing the only evidence of what the last 15 minutes had cost him. He looked at Palpatine the way you look at something you have fully accounted for and fully contained and have no further fear of. "We won't." Palpatine looked at him. Then he looked at Anakin. Then he looked at the floor and said nothing else, and the morning light came through the cracked window and fell across a man in force suppression cuffs, standing in the ruins of an office that had housed the most dangerous individual in the galaxy for 20 years. The most dangerous individual in the galaxy. Past tense, Kohler opened the doors. The temple guards entered in their silent pairs. Outside in the corridor, Anakin could hear the building, the ambient sound of a structure continuing its business, the distant murmur of staff on other floors who did not yet know what had happened in this room. They would. But that was someone else's chapter. This one was done. 2 days later, the Galactic Senate convened under emergency session protocols for the first time in the history of the Republic. The chamber filled slowly, which was itself unusual. Senate sessions typically assembled with the managed chaos of a body that had developed, over 1,000 years of practice, its own particular rhythm of arrival, delegations floating their pods into position, aides clustering at the railings, the ambient noise of 2,000 representatives settling into the business of governance. It was, under normal circumstances, a sound like a market finding its opening hour. This morning it was quiet, not the quiet of an empty room, the quiet of a full one holding itself still. Pod after pod drifted into position with less conversation than usual. Less of the cross-delegation socializing that typically filled the assembly period. Senators who would ordinarily be working their neighbors for procedural favors sat with their aides and their data pads and their expressions, carefully managed. The public galleries above the chamber floor, accessible by lottery to Republic citizens and restricted to 100 seats under emergency session rules, were full. Had been full since before the chamber opened. People had waited in the queue through the previous night. The central dais was empty. Where the Chancellor's pod would ordinarily hover, dominant and elevated above the chamber's geometry, there was an absence. No pod. No figure. The space where Palpatine had presided over 1,000 sessions of manufactured democracy was simply open air. And the open air had its own weight. Padma Amidala's pod moved into position at the chamber's center, and the ambient noise dropped another degree. She had not slept. Anakin could tell from the specific quality of her stillness, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of someone who had been working for 48 hours and had replaced sleep with focus so completely that the body had simply agreed to continue. She stood at the pod's forward rail with Bail Organa to her left and Mon Mothma to her right, and the three of them looked out at the assembled Senate with the expression of people who had prepared for exactly this and were not surprised to find it arrived. Bail had the documentation. 48 hours of it, the medical certification from Kix, signed and countersigned by 3 additional Republic medical officers, documenting the inhibitor chip in Rex's neural tissue and the corroborating evidence from 3 additional troopers. The chain of custody notation was meticulous. Bail had insisted on that. A legal proceeding failed on chain of custody as often as it failed on evidence, and this proceeding was not going to fail. Mon Mothma had the votes. Not all of them. Enough of them, the Reform Bloc, the Outer Rim moderates, the Mid-Rim independents who had been growing quietly uneasy about the Chancellor's accumulating authority for 2 years, and had lacked, until now, the specific evidentiary weight to act on their unease. They had it now. The session opened. Padme spoke first. She had been a senator for long enough that the chamber's acoustics were as familiar to her as her own apartment. She knew where the sound went, how to pitch her voice to reach the upper galleries without straining for the pods at the chamber's distant edges. She spoke without notes. She had written the address in her head across the 2 days since the arrest, revised it continuously, and arrived at something that was not an argument so much as an account. She told them what had happened. In sequence. Without rhetorical escalation. The clone army's inhibitor chips, what they were designed to do, what they would have done to every Jedi in the galaxy at a single signal from a single office. The relay override and how it was placed. The strike team and the arrest. She named the people involved: Mace Windu, Anakin Skywalker, Kit Fisto, Aegon Kolar, Saesee Tiin. She named Captain Rex and Kix. She named Jocasta Nu and the Jedi Shadows. She did not name them as heroes. She named them as witnesses. The chamber listened. The specific quality of its listening changed as she spoke, the initial careful neutrality giving way, in stages, to something that was not shock exactly but its aftermath, the state of a body in the process of reorganizing itself around a new and unwanted piece of information. When she finished, she stepped back from the rail. Bail stepped forward with the documentation. The evidence presentation took 40 minutes. Bail moved through it with the methodical care of a man who had been building this case in his head for years, and had simply been waiting for the facts to catch up with the structure. The chip documentation. The financial trails, a thread running from Palpatine's private Senate accounts through a series of intermediary banking entities to separatist procurement networks. Established during the Clovis affair and never fully closed, now suddenly and completely legible in light of everything else. A record of communications between the Chancellor's office and Dooku's inner circle, pulled from the archive by Jocasta Nu in the 24 hours following the arrest. The chamber's quiet deepened with each element. Not the quiet of skepticism. The quiet of addition, each piece placed beside the last. The shape of the whole becoming clearer with every addition. The shape being something that could not be absorbed quickly, because absorbing it meant revising too much else. There were objections. Of course there were objections. A senior senator from the core worlds rose first, with the practiced outrage of a man who had long been a reliable voice for the Chancellor's initiatives and had too much invested in that reliability to immediately abandon it. He challenged the chain of custody on the chip documentation. Bail answered him, point by point, with the specific pleasure of a man who had anticipated every challenge and prepared for it. The senator sat. A delegate from the Outer Rim territories challenged the jurisdiction of Jedi testimony in a civil proceeding. Mon Mothma answered her, the constitutional provision, Section 47, emergency powers review triggered by material evidence of criminal conspiracy, which applied to any testimony relevant to the conspiracy's existence regardless of the witness's organizational affiliation. The delegate sat. There were 2 more challenges. Both answered. Both seated. Then the chamber was quiet again, and Padme returned to the rail. This body, she said, has been the instrument of its own subversion for 20 years. Not through our failure, through our trust. We trusted the institutions we had built to be as strong as we believed them to be. And someone who understood those institutions better than we did, exploited that trust systematically. She paused. What we are doing today is not revenge. It is not correction after the fact. It is the Constitution functioning exactly as it was designed to function, as the last line of defense against exactly this. The founders of this republic wrote Section 47 knowing, as we must know, that the greatest threat to democracy is not external, it is internal. It is the slow accumulation of power by a single office beyond the reach of accountability. She looked across the chamber. Today we exercise accountability. That is all. That is everything. The vote was called. It moved through the pods in a wave, the reform bloc first, then the outer rim moderates, then the mid-rim independents, then a cascading series of delegations whose calculations had been running since Bale's presentation concluded and had arrived at the only defensible conclusion available to them. The holdouts were visible, a cluster of pods that waited, whose lights stayed neutral while others turned green, whose delegates sat with the particular stillness of people whose political mathematics were in the process of painful revision. Some of them turned eventually. Most of them. The final count was not close. Emergency motion carried. Palpatine's executive powers suspended pending formal criminal trial. Remanded to Jedi custody, not Republic custody, not Senate security, but Jedi custody specifically, at the motion of Senator Organa on the grounds that the security failure which had allowed this conspiracy to proceed for 20 years had occurred within Republic institutional structures, and that an external custodial authority was therefore appropriate. One holdout senator, a Moon delegate whose name Anakin wouldn't remember later, called out from his pod as the final count was being logged, "The Jedi have no legal authority to imprison a Republic citizen." Mace, standing at the chamber's observer rail, said, "The Senate just gave it to us." The Moon sat. The sentencing motion carried 20 minutes later. Permanent imprisonment beneath the Jedi Temple. Not execution, not a Republic detention facility. Not a tribunal with appeals and procedural delays, and the slow erosion of momentum that a sufficiently resourced defendant could engineer across years of litigation. Beneath the temple. Where the Force could be monitored. Where the specific architecture of Sith power could be contained by the only organization in the galaxy with the knowledge and capability to contain it. Mace had proposed it. He had addressed the full Senate from the observer rail with the directness of a man who had no interest in performing conviction, because the conviction was simply present. "The Jedi do not kill what we can contain," he said. That was always the point we were trying to make. The chamber voted again. Carried afterward, in the Senate's corridor, in the specific exhausted quiet of a thing concluded. Anakin stood with Padme and Bale and Mon Mothma, and none of them said anything for a moment. Bale looked at the chamber doors. 1,000 years, he said, and the Constitution held. Padme looked at Anakin. Anakin looked at the corridor, the high stone walls, the banners, the distant sound of the chamber beginning to clear behind them. He thought about what it meant that this had worked. Not the tactics of it, the fact of it. That it had been possible to walk into a room and tell the truth and have it received as truth, and for that simple action to cascade outward across 2 days into a chamber of 2,000 representatives and emerge, on the other side, as law. He hadn't believed, in the hangar, that it would work this cleanly. He had believed it was the right thing to do. Those were not always the same belief. Today they had been. Outside the Senate building, Coruscant was going about its afternoon, the traffic lanes full, the newscasts running, the city's 10 trillion inhabitants processing what they were hearing in their own ways and at their own speeds. Something had changed in the architecture of the next 30 years. Quietly, legally, without a single death. The galaxy didn't know yet what to do with that. Neither did Anakin. But he had time to figure it out. For the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he had time. He asked to come before the full council. Not summoned, not called to account. He sent the request himself, through the standard channels, in the formal language of a Jedi petitioning for audience. And then he waited in the corridor outside the council chamber with his hands at his sides and the particular quality of nervousness that belongs not to a man expecting catastrophe, but to a man who has chosen, for the first time, to be fully seen and is not yet certain what being fully seen costs. The doors opened. He went in. The chamber was exactly as it had always been. 12 seats in their circle, the Coruscant skyline visible through every window, the light at this hour coming in low and gold from the west, painting the stone floor in long, warm bars. Yoda was present via hologram from Kashyyyk, his image small and green and steady in the center of the circle. The remaining masters in person, Mace, Kit Fisto, Aegon Kolar, Ceci Teen, and 5 others, occupied their seats with the particular stillness of people who had been told this meeting would not be procedural and had prepared accordingly. Anakin stood in the center of the room. He did not pace. He did not reach for the careful, sequenced argument he'd built and rebuilt across the walk from his quarters. He stood in the center of the council chamber and looked at the people in it and said the true thing. I've been married to Padma Amidala for almost 3 years. The room received it. Nobody moved. It began on Naboo, before Geonosis. It was secret from the start, because I believed, we both believed, that the council would see it as a failure of discipline, a breach of the code, a reason to reassign me, or limit my missions, or confirm the doubt I always felt coming off this room every time I stood in it. He paused. The gold light moved slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above the city. I kept it secret because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. And I'm telling you now because I'm done making decisions from that place. He looked at Mace. I'm not asking for leniency. I understand what the code says about attachment. I understand what it was designed to prevent. I'm not arguing against it. He looked at Yoda's hologram. I'm telling you the truth. That's all. And if the council decides that this requires my resignation from the order, I'll submit it. Tonight, without argument. He stopped talking. The chamber was very quiet. Outside the windows, Coruscant's late afternoon moved in its eternal, indifferent circulation. The traffic lanes, the distant towers, the city's 10 trillion lives going about the business of existing. Yoda spoke first. His voice came through the hologram with the slight thinning that transmission always gave it. But the weight beneath the voice was intact, the weight of centuries of attention paid to living things and the patterns they made. Married, he said. Not a question. Not a verdict. Just the word, held in the space, turned over. Yes, Master, and told us. You have not. For almost 3 years. No, Master. Yoda was quiet for a moment. His eyes, half closed, moved with the slow deliberateness of someone reading something very long in a small amount of text. Afraid, you were, he said. Yes, of us. The word landed differently than Anakin expected it to, not as an accusation, as an accounting. Yoda receiving information and recording it accurately, without deflection. Yes, Anakin said, of this room. Of what it would decide about me. Another silence, longer than the first. Then Yoda said, It was not a sound of disapproval. It was the sound of being made when the thing in front of them confirmed something they had suspected for a long time and were not pleased to have confirmed, because confirmation meant the failure was real, and real failures required real reckoning. Mace's hands rested flat on the arms of his chair. He had been looking at Anakin steadily since the doors opened, with the expression he'd had in the hangar 3 days ago, not the managed wariness of a council member evaluating a subordinate, but the full attention of a man taking accurate measure of another. You expected us to punish you, Mace said. I expected you to confirm what I already believed about myself. Anakin let that sit for a moment. That I was too much, too attached, too angry, too everything the council had never quite said directly but had communicated in every room I'd ever stood in. He paused. The gold light moved again. I thought if you knew the whole truth of me, you'd find the parts I was afraid of finding myself. Kit Fisto, in his seat to the left, said quietly, and instead? Anakin looked at him. Instead, Mace Windu believed me in a hangar. And the whole architecture I'd built around the fear, the lies, the secrecy, the decisions I made to protect something that should never have needed protecting, all of it was built on a premise that turned out to be wrong. The chamber held that. Yoda's hologram shifted slightly, the small adjustment of a being changing posture, leaning forward by a degree. Destroyed the galaxy, he said. Our own fear almost did. His voice was unhurried, carrying the cadence of someone speaking a thing they had been turning over for 3 days, and were now ready to say aloud. Saved it. Your honesty did. Learn from this. The order must. He paused. Learn from this, I must. Anakin looked at the small green figure in the center of the circle. He had spent years in the presence of Yoda's authority without ever quite locating the being beneath it. The master who could move mountains with the Force and speak in riddles that resolved themselves only after the moment had passed. He looked at him now and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not diminishment, but dimension. A being old enough to have made errors across centuries and wise enough to recognize them when they finally arrived with evidence attached. "The resignation," Mace said. "We're not accepting it." Anakin looked at him. "The code," Mace continued, "was written to address something real. Attachment becomes possession. Possession becomes fear. Fear becomes the thing we've spent this week dismantling from the inside of the Chancellor's office." He held Anakin's gaze. "But the code was written by beings who were afraid of what they couldn't control, and a rule written from fear, enforced through fear, maintained through the silence of people too afraid to say what's true. That's not wisdom. That's the same architecture. Different address." The chamber was very still. "You told the truth," Mace said. 3 days ago in that hangar, and today, in this room. Both times it cost you something to do it. Both times the order was better for it." He paused. "We're not going to respond to honesty with punishment. Not today. Not going forward." He looked around the room, at Fisto, at Kolar, at the circle of faces that held the authority of the oldest institution in the galaxy. No one acts alone. That was always the point. It has to mean something. He looked back at Anakin. "The Council grants you the rank of Jedi Master, Skywalker." The words entered the room and stayed there. Anakin did not speak for a moment. He stood in the gold afternoon light and let the words be real, and found that the thing he had expected to feel, the vindication, the completion of something long denied, was quieter than expected. Not smaller. Quieter, the difference between a fire and warmth. He bowed. 6 weeks later, Naboo in the early morning was water and mist, and the particular green smell of a planet that had never learned to be anything but alive. The lake country outside Varakino caught the first light slowly, the sun coming up behind the hills to the east and laying itself across the water in long, broken pieces that shifted with the current. Anakin sat on the steps outside the villa with his hands around a cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Behind him, inside, he could hear Padmé moving through the morning. Her quiet efficiency, the small domestic sounds of a person who inhabited a space fully and without performance. Further in, the sounds that had existed in this house for 4 months now and still produced, each morning. The same sensation in his chest. 2 voices, small, not words yet, not consistently, but sounds with intent behind them. The proto-language of 2 people who had arrived in the world with opinions and were in the process of developing the vocabulary for them. Luke had his mother's directness. Leia had his stubbornness. These were early assessments, subject to revision. He did not revise them. Padmé appeared in the doorway behind him, a blanket over her shoulders, and looked at the water and then at him. "You're thinking loudly," she said. "I'm always thinking loudly. This is a specific kind of loud." She came and sat beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched. She looked at his face with the reading quality attention she'd always had. The way she moved through a room of information and found the relevant thing quickly. Good loud or complicated loud? He considered it. Neither, he said. Just, present loud. The kind where there's nothing to solve. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the lake, and the mist coming off it, and the light finding its way through in pieces. "I used to think losing you," Anakin said, "was the only thing I couldn't survive." He held the cold cup and looked at the water. "I know now that was never the real fear. The real fear was never having to become myself. Never having to find out what was underneath all of it if I stopped being afraid long enough to look." Padmé was quiet beside him. Inside the villa, one of the twins made a sound of strong opinion about something. Anakin set the cup down. Padmé rose with him, and they went inside together, into the warmth and the noise, and the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable texture of a life that had been earned across 3 days of truth-telling, and a decade of finally putting down the right things. The lake caught the morning behind them. The mist burned off slowly, the way it always did. The sun came through. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.